Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this event that we're hosting on International Women's Day. If my history and my mathematics is correct, this is the 111th anniversary of the first International Women's Day, which was in 1911. I guess people disagree. I have 1911 in Copenhagen, is what I read. Where I think importantly for our meeting, the aim was to advance the situation of, and I quote, "working women and girls" was the language that was used. And although the issue of the vote and women's right to vote was clearly central, I think it's important because it was always framed as going as something more than the right to work. Issues around working conditions and related social conditions were central. And indeed, by 1914, when we actually celebrated International Women's Day as a worldwide event on the 8th of March, because the first time it was celebrated on the 19th of March, not the 8th of March, but on the 8th of March, the issue of the vote and social conditions were not the only challenges that were recognized. Also, issues around paid and unpaid work, which continues to be a part of the gender challenge, what Alexandra Kollontai called the family problem back in 1914. And not, I mean, tragically, it was also in 1914 a march against war too. So there's a kind of historical parallel there. I mean, and more importantly, I think it's a recognition that the multiple inequities that go with the gender question have always been on the table. It's never been a singular issue. Intersectionality has always been part of the gender struggle, as it was a century ago. And of course, from our perspective in UNCTAD, where our focus is very much on developing countries, these are challenges that are multiplied because of the structure of their economies, still heavily rural, extensively informal in terms of the urban economy, and these compound and add to the gender challenges that we continue to struggle with, and that will be very much the focus of the presentation that Elissa will give today, based upon some work that Elissa did for us around a project we have on the Belt and Road initiative, focusing on 3 countries: Ethiopia, Indonesia, and Sri Lanka, and we'll come to that in a second. But I'd like to ask Isabel, our Deputy Secretary General, to make some opening remarks, if you would, on this occasion. Isabel, thank you.
Thank you, Richard. And we will not have a conflict on the date, 1910 or 1911. In any case, a long time ago, and it's true that it's not the end of the story, for sure, especially today with what we know everywhere in the world, and especially in one part of the world. So it's true that the world has started moving beyond the pandemic, fortunately. But the question is, will it be to a better place or back to business as usual? And given the current situation, we are certainly not back to business as usual, but neither on the way towards a better place. The experience of the last 2 years have taught us vital lessons about how a combination of unexpected shocks and growing inequality can generate economic fragilities and reinforce political divisions. Clearly, there is a room and a need to build a more inclusive and resilient path forward. But positive change requires deliberate and strategic use of policy at the national, regional, and global levels. And we know that the COVID crisis has had a disproportionate negative impact on women and girls. Often women were the first to lose their jobs in this crisis, and they had less access to social protection and finance to enable the survival of their businesses when they had the businesses. They also faced a disproportionate burden of care work, and many girls were taken out of school to help at home. The pandemic has become the glaring evidence of structural injustices in the existing social and economic system. A system which relies on taking advantage of many underpaid laborers, what just Richard mentioned, often without or little social protection, countless women and girls. Gender inequality is the oldest and longest standing structural and systematic injustice. Throughout history and across countries, women have been responsible for the lion's share of unpaid care and invisible work. This has been perpetuated with entering social norms and stereotypes, which cause barriers or at least hurdles for women's participation in the labor market and their empowerment through earning income and gaining financial independence, which is of course key. In more recent history, inequalities and gender inequality in particular were exacerbated when state capacities were systematically shrunk from the 1980s onwards. The reduction in the public provision of health and education services, the regulation of markets and dissolving social safety nets means an increasing reliance on unpaid labor and goodwill, especially for women and girls. Oxfam estimates that the economic value of unpaid care work is around $11 trillion per year. So to put this into perspective, it is 3 times more than the global tech industry and about 10% of global GDP. In some ways, COVID has helped to make invisible or undervalued work more visible. And we remember the phrase about essential worker. It has been used often, but not to refer to the highly paid at the top of the career ladder, but to many in low or lower paid work, such as nurses, cashiers, etc. And yet it remains to be seen whether the crisis leads to societies that value more and pay better these jobs. The problem does not stop here, and even the economic sectors where women's employment and contribution is actually acknowledged, we need to change things profoundly to ensure that women and also men can properly benefit. So what needs to be done to recover better and to a more equal world? This question is at the core of today's event and as well as integral to our work in UNCTAD. The study that will be presented by Elisa today also contributed to this purpose. The study looks at policies needed to advance gender equality in the context of the wider development challenges facing developing countries. It offers a framework for analysis which is applied in 3 countries, as Richard mentioned, Ethiopia, Indonesia, and Sri Lanka. It highlights a number of important points and suggests a way forward. And while an overview will be presented in a few minutes, I will not go in this direction, but I would like to highlight one point which reflects the fundamental concern. As jobs become more intensive in terms of capital or technology, women tend to be excluded. That's a lesson of the past, but it's also the case today. In other words, women get stuck in jobs with lower pay and less growth potential. To achieve better outcomes, the study provides a blueprint for mainstreaming gender into national policies. And let me just highlight 4 points. First, it suggests using gender as a lens into the social inclusion and development impact of industrial and trade policies. Second, it proposes refocusing industrial and trade policies to target broad-based structural transformation and higher productivity employment generation for both women and men. Third, it emphasizes the need to counter traditional gender norms and current stereotypes that keep women from participating in trade and structural transformation on an equal footing with men. This is particularly important in the context of increasing technological intensity and the digital gender gap, which is also a big issue. And 4, it urged including explicitly social infrastructure and investment in the care economy as part of industrial policy making. So it's not a coincidence that we are launching this report on International Women's Day. The 8th of March is an important reminder, as we just discussed, on the unfinished business toward gender equality. And in no country in the world is gender equality a reality today. That is why, on this way, last year, I launched the initiative Les 8 du mois until we are there. So it means that I think that a lot of 8 du mois will take place before we are there. But it's why it's important not only the 8th of March, but every month and every task to look at this gender gap and how we can fulfill that. So there is still much progress to be made to create a world in which men and women share the same rights, have the same opportunities, and enjoy same freedoms, which is not the case today. So in this context, I thank you for the attention, and I'm looking forward for the presentation of the student. Thank you.
Isabel, thank you very much for that introduction, and let me move straight on to the presentation of the study that we are launching today. Elissa will present the study, and we have a couple of people to add and discuss the work, who I will introduce after Elissa's presentation. Elissa is the professor of economics and the chair of the department at Colorado State University in Fort Collins, Colorado, and she's also the editor or the editor-in-chief of Feminist Economics, which is the leading journal and that explores the intersection between economic issues and gender issues. And most of them, important of all, she was also a colleague of ours at UNCTAD a few years ago, and we are very sorry we lost her to the world of academia, but that's how it goes, I guess. Elissa, you have around 15 minutes to present. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Isabel, for that very nice lead in. And thank you, everyone, for being here today. It's really wonderful to be here. This is my first international trip since the pandemic came raining down. So it's nice to be back here in Geneva in particular. And it was a really interesting project to do this research, in the sense that it was sort of a return to some of the issues that I worked on when I was here at UNCTAD. And you can start the PowerPoint. Thank you. And I thought can you go up one? I think it's there we go. Okay, thanks. So it's a long, complicated paper, and I don't have a lot of time to talk. So I thought I would focus in the place that Isabel also focused. So it's a good lead-in the sense of focusing on the recommendations and trying to tease out some of them more specifically. And so this paper looks at mainstreaming gender in national policies, the cases of Ethiopia, Indonesia, and Sri Lanka. Oh, that's okay.
Maybe that's why technology.
I know. It's like,
stop, please. I'm not sure that you are better than that.
Okay. Okay, great. So we can advance to the next one. Okay. So I wanted to start by laying out some priors to this discussion and some prospects looking forward. So a key prior that structures this study is that the notion that industrialization in particular is a central driver of the structural transformation and wealth accumulation that drive development, and this, or that support development. And this is true both on the supply side, which is, I think, how we're used to thinking about industrialization and these sort of positive externalities, increasing returns, backward and forward linkages throughout the economy. But it also supports development on the demand side. In this report, I focus in particular on the pathway through employment and how the growth of employment in modernizing sectors is both key for structural transformation and differs in terms of their impacts for women versus men. So paired with this is the important point that globalization and export-led industrialization in particular have offered key pathways for speeding up industrialization in the modern era, access to bigger markets, being able to enter global value chains pretty easily. There are lots of reasons that globalization and export-led industrialization have the capacity to boost industrialization. And when we're thinking about gender in particular, this increase in export orientation has across the world been associated with the growth of women's manufacturing employment in particular, at least when export-led industrialization is in its early sort of labor-intensive stages. And so putting these two pieces together, I think gender is a really useful lens for analyzing the social inclusion of trade and industrialization, right? So it's not just talking about women, we're talking about women and men, but in particular, using it as a lens to understand social inclusion. And so the focus of the 3 country studies that I get into is to look at productivity growth at the aggregate level. And by productivity growth, I just mean being able to produce more value for a given level of inputs. And this is the key, it's almost what economists think of as development, at least in macro. And to decompose the sources of this productivity growth, not only by sector, but also by gender through the medium of employment to understand the dynamics of structural transformation. Are women moving into higher productivity sectors? Are men moving into higher productivity sectors? How does productivity growth in particular sectors affect the employment offered in those sectors? Do workers have access to these higher productivity, potentially higher wage jobs, right? This is a key way that, at least in terms of modern processes of industrialization, that workers have been able to participate in and access, right, the benefits of productivity growth on the demand side in terms of the labor market. Okay. Oh, I can do it here, huh? All right. Thank you. So starting with recommendations, as we've said a couple times, using gender as a lens into the social inclusion and development impact of industrial and trade policy. So there are some opportunities here, some of which I've already talked about. Export-led industrialization in particular has enabled women in many countries to move out of traditional agriculture, informal services, or unpaid family work into a modernizing sector to earn income. And this connection between export orientation and women's employment is so strong that it prevails in countries even when women's labor force participation in their participation in paid work is otherwise very low. And so we see this, for instance, in Indonesia and in Sri Lanka. It also provides an opportunity in the sense of shifting women's production from unpaid work in the household or family enterprise to paid work in the market. And this transfer in and of itself creates more growth. It also facilitates structural transformation because you have individuals moving from lower productivity, more traditional production activities to higher productivity work. And it also enables the expansion of exported manufacturers in particular, right, with positive externalities for industrialization and growth. Thank you. But there are also some challenges associated with this strategy. Women tend to be concentrated in sectors where productivity levels and productivity growth are lower than sectors dominated by men. And that's one of the issues that's explored in the study. Technological change and increasing capital intensity tends to be more costly for women's employment than it is for men, meaning women lose jobs at a faster rate than men do. And these connections are cast in a context where there's overall a weakening connection between industrialization and employment, right? As we get more technological intensity or capital intensity of production, industrialization as a process of development itself is creating less employment than it did 30 or 40 years ago. And so this is an issue that affects both women and men. Now, part of this story has to do with price constraints. I don't write a lot about it in the paper, but I think it's important to note. That was good background music for the point. So in terms of the labor-intensive export-led industrialization stage, competition is very intense, particularly in the low value added parts of global value chains. And this intense competition constrains price increases, right? Because the profit margins are very low. And these price constraints also have consequences for wage growth. It tends to constrain wage growth. So in that sense, merely participating in global value chains is not enough to drive development or socially inclusive industrialization. We have to look at what that participation, what impact it's having on structural transformation and employment. Thank you. So this is a related recommendation. So in that sense, industrial and trade policies must target not just productivity growth within lead sectors. So sometimes, for instance, we focus on, say, how productivity is growing within manufacturing. To deliver development, there must be a broad-based structural transformation, right? And it's through that structural transformation, the shifting of individuals or employment from low productivity to higher productivity employment, this becomes a key generator of high quality employment for both women and men. In this study, we find that for the 3 countries, most productivity growth is happening within sectors. So within sectors, they are modernizing, but there's much less movement from low productivity work to higher productivity work, right? So you may get a really great manufacturing sector that is modernizing, but it's not generating very much employment. So the impact then on aggregate productivity, meaning the productivity of the country as a whole, is not clear. Because if you increase productivity in one sector and say the increased productivity doesn't create much employment, or it actually lowers employment, right, workers can move from higher productivity to lower productivity employment, and it can drag down aggregate productivity. So that's a sense in which I think it's really important to combine a sectoral approach with a macroeconomic approach and to understand what's happening throughout the economy. Okay, thank you. So this is just an illustration because I couldn't resist. This is a decomposition of productivity growth in the 3 of the countries that we looked at, and then also China as a comparison. The orange bars is productivity growth that's happening within sectors, and these are annual averages for the 3 periods, the 1990s, the 2000s, the 2010s. And then the yellow is aggregate productivity growth that is due to structural change, meaning the movement of people from lower productivity to higher productivity activities. And so if you add the 2 bars together, you get the average annual total productivity growth over that period. But once again, I wanted to say that we could see in China, right, most of China's productivity growth is also happening within sectors, but its numbers are so high overall. now. And it's at a different stage in terms of structural transformation. So that's also something to consider. But then you have Sri Lanka, also impressive within sector productivity growth, but hardly anything is happening in terms of structural transformation. And so what that indicates to me is that there's a lot of possibility or prospect for increasing overall productivity growth by trying to tie some of this within sector modernization to creating more higher wage opportunities for workers. Okay. So I have 3 minutes. All right, then I'm just going to do one of these slides. So this is just to give you an illustration of the kind of study, the kind of work that we did. On the left, the vertical axis is labor productivity in that sector relative to overall aggregate productivity. And the red line there, the horizontal red line equals 1, which means that the productivity in that sector equals aggregate productivity, right? So the height of the bars is relative labor productivity. The width of the bars is the proportion of that group's employment in that sector. So for instance, in 2018 in Ethiopia, looking at the left, 56.8% of women's employment was in agriculture. 73% of men's employment was in agriculture. Manufacturing is a more important source of employment for women than men in Ethiopia. About 12% of women's employment in Ethiopia. And I think it's like, I can't see this slide underneath, but it's something like 9 or 7% for men. But one thing to note here is that the productivity, manufacturing productivity is quite low by economy-wide standards. And this is associated with the extent of informalization and low productivity manufacturing work that is happening in that sector. And it affects both women and men, but it has a particularly prominent impact on women. And so there's more discussion about why this is and how it's gendered, but it gives you just an example of how looking at this intersectoral productivity levels, the distribution of women and men across different sectors can help you understand what the dynamics of structural transformation are. So we can go through the next few because I don't have time. So I think an important recommendation here and something that Isabel had touched on was the importance of countering traditional gender norms and stereotypes that keep women from participating in trade and structural transformation on an equal footing with men. Women tend to get segregated into lower productivity work, right? This is something that we talked about at the beginning, but I think this is particularly pressing in the context of ongoing increasing technological intensity. And also, as we talk about prospects for greening jobs, many of those jobs are middle skill type jobs, which in terms of moving forward on a green agenda for development and structural transformation, we really need to pay attention to gender stereotypes and ensuring women's access to this new type of work. And then my last point, which I always talk about in these papers, because I think it's essential, is that we need to stop thinking about industrial policy as just being about traditional industry. It's important to think about social infrastructure and investments in the care economy as part of industrial policy. We think of investment as being in physical buildings and roads or technology, but in fact, investment is about anything that expands future productivity, which of course includes people. And our goals for social inclusion and ecological sustainability require these kinds of investments. And so thinking in these terms has implications not only for industrial policy, but it also has implications for how we think about public borrowing for health and education, for instance, and the employment consequences of fiscal policy choices. And if we are going to move down this road, or we should move down this road, one of the key things we need to talk about is the incredibly low wages that are associated with care work, paid care work, most of which is done by women. So thank you for your attention today.
Great, thank you very much, Elisa. I should say that if people have questions, they should put them into the chat, right? I think into the chat, and we will pick up at the end as many as we can, and see if we can generate a discussion around them. I mean, as I said, we've also asked some people to address the issues that Elisa's paper is looking at, and if we start with Lekha Chakrabarti, which I think picks up on your last point very much, who will talk about gender sensitization of national budgets in the Indian context. Lekha is a professor at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy and elected member of the governing board of management at the International Institute of Public Finance in Munich, the World Association of Public Finance and the World Association of Public Finance Economists. She's also a research affiliate at the Levy Economics Institute at Bard College in New York, and she is a pioneer economist in institutionalizing gender budgeting in India. Lekha, you have the floor for around 8 to 10 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And let me begin with the point, Elisa was making about, the fiscal policy. Of course, India is a leading example of gender budgeting, and it has sustained the gender budgeting process since 2000. But the issue, as rightly highlighted by Elisa, the problem is high fiscal deficit and high debt. So if you ask me a moment whether high fiscal deficit and high debt, that's really a problem. I have written a book about it, that the deficit is good in times of crisis and a timely deficit is good. So that's exactly the backdrop of Union Budget 2022-23 in India. We have very high fiscal deficit and high debt. And it is quite substantiated from the point of view and from the position of strength. Finance Minister has articulated that it is for enhancing the public investment. And again, as Elisa mentioned, it is for the capital infrastructure and the physical infrastructure. So when you meticulously look into this budget, the problem is related to the revenue spending, the social infrastructure, and if you ask me about the care economy, a comprehensive care economic infrastructure or such kind of policies, we have not yet begun in the context of India. But of course, it's a leading example in the context of gender budgeting, because the focus was on the energy infrastructure. And for the first time ever, this government has given focus to the energy infrastructure gender budgeting by providing, clean fuel to women in the low income households. But the problem is the sustainability of this, exercise in the energy infrastructure. In this budget statement, when we look into, we have not seen that, that program is still running. So this is the problem. Once you announce a program, but it's just get into the unsustainable mode. And if you look into the detailed numbers, you don't get the program running. And another example I can tell you that which is unsustainable nature is like, we have discrimination in our country even prior to birth. And there was a program announced by the government to tackle this, the issues related to discrimination even before birth. But in the convergence, in the public expenditure convergence process, we cannot even track the spending that is related to this program, which needs to be there on board. So these are the issues when it comes to public expenditure convergence, macro sense, the convergence is good. But when it comes to the human development components, we are unable to track whether that program is on or not. So that's unsustainability is one issue. And the second important issue related to gender budgeting, and of course, the macro fiscal parameter is the budget credibility. If you look into the macro fiscal parameters, what is announced in the budget and what is actual. If you get into this deviation, there is significant deviation between what is announced and what is, coming as actual. And why this deviation? We have done in an IPFP where I work into this fiscal forecasting errors, and the reasons for many macro fiscal parameters was random in nature, but in case of intergovernmental fiscal transfer to the subnational governments, and in case of tax projections, and in case of capital spending, we could identify that the bias of the policymaker and the assumptions he's making, that's getting into the, the way the estimates are made. And this gets percolated down to the sectoral level and to the gender budgeting level. So we need to look into the budget credibility. And, we don't have fiscal councils in India. And usually in any country, it's a fiscal council that looks into, it's kind of a watchdog and looks into the elements related to the fiscal marksmanship. But NIPFP, we look into these issues and we identified that budget credibility, and that relates to the fiscal risk and what we project and the fiscal forecasting errors. So this is yet another important issue that when it comes to the gender budgeting, this is very crucial to look into, the budget credibility and the fiscal marksmanship analysis. And now, in the context of pandemic, we have announced many economic stimulus programs. And if you apply a gender lens to these economic stimulus programs from the RBI side, the Reserve Bank of India, our central bank, and also from the Ministry of Finance, we had only two programs which were related to the gender. One was a targeted cash transfer, which is flowing into the hands of people. But if you ask me the magnitude of cash transfer to the women in the care economy, that was just insignificant. And the second, they're trying to strengthen the energy infrastructure gender budgeting, but that was unsustainable because in this 2022 gender budgeting statement, we can't see that program which is for the energy infrastructure. So then the pandemic related economic stimulus programs are short-term in nature. And when we have to go ahead with the normalization procedures, what we have to do is to focus on the public financial management tools like gender budgeting. So unless we strengthen the PFM tool like gender budgeting, we won't be able to get that sustainable gender equality goals. And, that process of strengthening the public financial management tool, if it is there, if you ask me, of course, that's there in terms of the financial inputs, but translating the resources to the results, that link, we need to work a little more on the accountability mechanisms. So to put the things in perspective, gender budgeting was, floated in our country from the perspective of fiscal innovation. Like any fiscal innovation, it has passed through 4 stages. Like in the beginning, there was a knowledge building, and NIPFP, that was a pioneering institute which looked into this model building aspects which are specific to the country, where we have given importance to the care economic infrastructure. But, in the following stages, like in the institutional building, the next phase, and in the capacity building, the 3rd phase, and the 4th phase on the accountability mechanisms, all what has happened is that we just got confined to just the gender budget statement. And if, of course, it was important from a fiscal transparency perspective and accountability perspective, but in the beginning, when it was a model building process in an IPFP, it was not talking about just a gender budget statement, but it was beyond that. So it was very important to go back to the, prior models and to look into the aspects of, more than just the gender budget statement, because that time it was a statement in all sense that we need to know how much the country is spending on gender development. But right now, the kind of discussions were just confined to the trend analysis based on the gender budget statement. So that needs to be widened, and it's an important challenge. And we have to get into the methodological advancement in terms of gender disaggregated benefit incidence analysis. Otherwise, mainstream spending, though it has got an intrinsic gender lens, the discussions and the debates in the context of India, that's just getting confined to the specifically targeted programs for women. So if that's the case, we are not going to get the details of gender budgeting. So that's why, as a promising framework, we need to get into the benefit incidence analysis through a gender lens. And we need to know whether there is an elite capture in, especially in the health, in the education, in social infrastructure across income quintiles, we need to look into, and these are the areas in which we need to strengthen the analysis. Otherwise, when compared to other countries in our region and across world, in G20 or OECD, one big advantage of the case of India's gender budgeting is it has gone through, the process of principle of subsidiarity. And the decisions have to be taken at the level which is closest to the people, that is principle of subsidiarity. So with the advent of fiscal decentralization, now gender budgeting is there in the subnational levels also, and at the third tier. That's one beautiful thing that has happened. And second is, it's not just confined to just expenditure analysis. We are getting into the intergovernmental fiscal, transfer mechanisms. And if you ask me the formula-based, intergovernmental fiscal transfers in India, whether that is gender aware, I can see that indirectly it is gender aware, but a criterion on gender into the unconditional grants that flows from the high levels of government, lower levels of government, that had to be integrated. But there is a kind of, understanding that the climate change is a part of intergovernmental fiscal transfer. It is not just to offset the fiscal disabilities, but it also can lead to discussions related to the climate change. So the argument is that if climate change can be the part of intergovernmental fiscal transfers, why can't we open that, promising framework of, intergovernmental fiscal transfer, especially the unconditional fiscal transfers, by incorporating a criterion on gender. And on the taxation side, of course, things are in very nascent stages, but in some states, there is a kind of entitlement which is given to the women in case of the property registration, that there is a differential in taxation rates. If the woman is registering for the property, the tax she has to give, that tax rate is relatively lower. So these kind of things, from the taxation side, if you ask me, that's a quite a tool of equity. To me, expenditure side is more a tool of equity, but the taxation side, as it is leading to the empowerment and the entitlement of property for the women, maybe we need to work a bit more on the taxation side. And the digital infrastructure, that's my final point. And of course, there is a digital divide in the context of India. And if you look at the enrollment rates and all, gender budgeting has got a positive impact in reducing the disparity between men and women, or the girls and boys, in the context of education. That's what the analysis from IMF by Janet Stotsky has shown. But in the context of pandemic, learning loss and the effective enrollment rate, if you look into the digital divide and the access of children to the systems and the networks, that's quite huge. So that needs to be integrated into the system. And in case of financial inclusion, this digital divide is affecting, the access of women to the system. Through the RBI or through central government, central bank, we have reduced the interest rate. But the reduction in the interest rate policy, that was one of the predominant narrative of economic stimulus package in India, that we are keeping the interest rate low and also a lot of liquidity infusion in the system. But when you apply a gender lens, it's not the cost of credit that matters for women, but the access to the credit that's huge for women. That's a matter of concern. And of course, credit infusion, if you look into the credit deployment statistics, the access that is quite uneven. So recovery, of course, we have an economic recovery, but India is recovering for whom? That uneven recovery is quite evident in the context of India. So I hope that outside the purview of the Union Budget 2022, we may be announcing a kind of welfare models which look into this issue of uneven recovery and inequality, where we need to strengthen the gender lens. Otherwise, we have this recovery, but it's not definitely for women and children, or for the, population belongs to the low rung of the pyramid. Thank you.
Lekha, thank you very much. And let's quickly move on to Mariama Williams. Mariama is a feminist economist with over 20 years experience working on economic development and macro trade, external debt and finance issues with a focus on gender equality and women's empowerment, social equality, sustainable finance, development, climate change issues. We know, of course, Mariama's work very well because she spent a number of years here in Geneva at the South Center, and so it's nice to see you again, Mariama. You have the screen. Microphone.
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Some people probably evening and night. Thank you, UNCTAD. Thank you for this opportunity to be on this thing. Happy Mother's Day, happy International Women's Day, Mother's Day, Sister Day, all of the genders day. It's great to be here. Thank you, Richard, for that very good introduction. I really appreciated the remarks made by Deputy Secretary Durant and Elissa. Of course, I've been spending the night reading your report, which is, of course, as always, excellent. So very good to see you and to hear your presentation. Thank you, Leka, for the stellar work you've been doing on gender budgeting and the India case studies. So that's really good. I really appreciate the references you made about the importance of the climate change and the climate fiscal linkage and how that relates to gender and gender budgeting. So appreciate that. So I don't have a lot much more to add. I think the panel has been really quite full and a lot to be digested. So I'll make a few remarks mainly about gender and structural change from the perspective of the Caribbean. That will be very small. And then most of my relationship will be talking about the theme of the panel, which is enhancing the role of women in structural transformation using climate/environmental link and maybe a few references to trade, but not so much. All right, my first point is that this discussion on the structural transformation and structural change, which we know now is going to be occurring. We don't know none of us have a crystal glass to say what's the post-pandemic look like, but from the point of view of many developing countries, it was really neat to hear some of the more optimistic tone about Indian recovery. But I know like for the Caribbean and others, it's not so optimistic. We're mirrored in debt and the pandemic has generated a lot of challenge on the key industries and sectors. And now we have the war. And so that creates a lot of things. Are we talking about structural transformation in the context of economic stagnation for some regions or other possibilities for others? I like the framework that I like to look at is the framework of Roderick and company, where they talk about fundamental challenges, because I think that's where for me the gender sits a lot. You know, the fundamental challenge and approach to how economy shifts and how you need the need for accumulating skills and broad institutional capabilities to generate sustained productivity growth in a way that Elissa talked about, not just in a few modern sector, but across a range of service, including non-tradable sector, as elaborating in the paper by McKillen and Roderick. I think for the Caribbean and many LDCs and even SIDS in some African countries, this question about gender and social transformation really will hang around institutional arrangements and possibilities and enhancement to enhance institutional arrangement, and as well as coherence in alignment, because I think that's where some of the problems lie. So we know that for the case of structural change and transformation in developing countries, it's been very heterogeneous, as much of the research has pointed out, even within and among African countries and within and among Caribbean countries. This transformation in ECLAC reports talk about maybe a 3-pillar transformation, knowledge-based intensivity, but also ECLAC has also highlighted the importance of integrating equality and rights as a pillar of any kind of social transformation within the Latin American and Caribbean region. And so I really start from those standpoint that these are critical. And though we know that there are economies that have gone through transformation without gender equality or strong gender equality, my starting point is that that's not an option for the region. right, for SIDS and for African countries, in particular, because we have tremendous amount of human resources that we need to motivate and to motivize. And so the social dimensions of structural change and transformation has to be a pivotal part of any forward discussion about structural transformation in our regions. And that means, of course, one of the key social dimensions is, of course, gender equality and women's rights, but also indigenous rights, disabilities, people with disability, and additionally youth. I think some of the research has been showing that I've looked at has been showing that when it comes to agricultural and rural transformation, which are critical for LDC, SIDS, and critical also to quite a few, if not most all, Caribbean countries, with the exception of maybe Barbados and Trinidad, that the transformation tend to benefit young men, and less so young women, except for farm. So women tend to be on farm, and they tend to have more increased work, increased burden. And so it depends on how the transformation has to be planned, and it has to have this conscious approach of integrating gender in industrial policy, in macro policy, in land reform, in labor policy. And that means the whole gamut of asset ownership, productivity gain, who is gaining, and where the distribution from the productivity gain, what are the benefits. So I think inequality and equality and assets and rights influences the production structure and are influenced by the production sector. And that means that we need to pay attention to technology development to ensure women's access and integration in technology, which brings a strong role for STEM, of course. Capacity building, critically important. And the social aspect in terms of integrating private sector development within at least that aspect of private sector development that A is being subsidized, whether it's direct subsidy or guarantees or other kinds of subsidies. So we know that one of the key aspects of development cooperation and ODA is the increasing rise of the approach to the private sector through guarantees and other kinds of processes. And those have to come with a gendered lens if they're going to not leave women behind. So social equality, particularly gender equality, is critical to integrate in the transformation of productive structure. And it's not an option, it's complementary to it. Key to this, of course, is environmental sustainability. Right? Environmental sustainability and how we go about dealing with the climate issues have implications for structural change and growth and for the kind of technology that we'll use, but also more importantly for sectoral diversification, right? So, and that's critical, not just for environment, but also for gender responsive trade, especially for those countries who are still highly dependent on trade. And here again, I think the same set of factors are critical for the environment/climate change sustainability, and that is gendered, as for trade policy, which is capacity building, especially in the realm of digitalization, which is becoming, after the pandemic, is becoming quite a big feature. Not to mention the issues of around taxation of digitalization, which is a whole nother question that we need to look at elsewhere. But the prioritizing of sectors and activities, the new jobs that could come out of, say, for example, low carbon economy, blue economy, and the different approaches that many of our governments are at least flirting with. Some are more serious about it. Some have actually elaborated blue economy plans and so forth. So what does that mean? And how is that incorporating gender issues? How is that upskilling? What are the specificity in terms of training, in terms of upskilling income and upskilling, the capacities for women to participate in the different sectors identified within the blue economy, or even the green economy, if that's some of the overriding framework. Then there's a question of income transfer mechanism to facilitate women's access to resource, to training, whether they're women in household, women in labor market, or women in SMEs. And so the whole bunch of implications that this whole research points to, and this discussion that you're launching in your project will have to grapple with if we're to seriously consider what the gender sensitive, the gender responsibility, and the enhancement and forward progression of gender equality and women's empowerment within developing countries. So I think agricultural transformation, land ownership, labor force participation, and all the various things that I saw in the report are critical here to getting higher levels of structural transformation. And my own timer has gone off, so I know that I'm way over my time. So I'd quickly like to flag a few challenges that I saw when I've looked at, and basically from UNFCCC, UNFCCC 2 years ago had a meeting talking to gender focal points about what they saw were the challenges for integrating gender into a policy approach from a climate and environmental perspective. And some of the issue that came up was, of course, things that Leka has talked about, and I think Elissa has flagged around institutional arrangement, the fact that a lot of the gender aspects are across different ministries and there's lack of coordination and lack of actual, we may have nice fancy language, we have gender action plan, we have gender sectoral plans, but how to operationalize them is missing. The finance, the technology capacity, the bringing together a functional multi-stakeholder groups at a technical level to understand the different tools and tactics that can be useful to make the gender really pop out and to make the gender really beneficial to the community that's being served. I know that planning and data analysis has been flagged in numerous reports as being one of the obstacles to the full integration of gender in national planning. But I think that coherence issue and that issue about building the capacity to gender impact assessment. We have a strong development of that in the trade area. It's less so in the environmental and climate area. So we need that, and along with the budgeting. So in each of the funds, right, of climate, there is a gender operational plan, but there is no gender budget that goes with it, right? And there is no gender fund that women's group, which arguably have smaller scale projects, which funders and even corporate funders don't like to deal with because of the high cost of dealing with fragmented small funds. But clearly, in a multilateral funds that's funded through government effort, we should have windows that have gender funds that would be able to support small SMEs, small women's group across different countries, and different countries should integrate across their national development plan, their sustainable development plan, their climate change plan, because they all now have climate change plan and environmental plan. They're all now saying, as a result of the declaration of Doha, the declaration of Buenos Aires Declaration on Trade, that they're all going to be incorporating gender into their trade policy. But we need to see how this enhancement of the institutional arrangements is going, and what are the coherence and the alignment mechanisms that are built in, critically around impact assessment and around budgeting and financing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a little bit of time left. Does everything come back to the role of the state, Lisa? That's what that would be one of my lessons from listening to Mariama. I have a question also. So I mean, I'll give you time to respond to those comments. And there's we have a question online from Katie Gologly-Swan, and I'll throw that into the mix too, so you can maybe respond, because I do think it's an important one that addresses some of your issues. She says around 60 countries were already spending more on debt servicing than on their health budgets prior to the pandemic. And several recent reports have shown that the IMF has been encouraging austerity for most countries with loan programs, even during the pandemic. Mm-hmm. What options are available to developing countries to finance the care economy / gender transformative public services in this context? And are there case studies to learn from? So I'll give you the floor to address what you can, and we'll wrap up. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much, Leka and Mariama, for those really interesting comments. I wish we had more time and we could have a sort of ongoing dialogue to build up all of the overlaps among our three talks. And one of the things that really came out in particular was thinking about, we're all talking about social dimensions and the sort of impacts of economic happenings, COVID and industrial policy on women versus men, or budgeting. I think an important piece here, and this was partly what I was trying to get at in my paper, was that and this is something that Mariama reminded me of, that gender not only is important in terms of thinking about the differential consequences of economic policy and health policy and education policy and fiscal policy, but it also, gender relations affect the very structure of production and decision making, right? So that it's both consequence and cause. And in my paper, I'm trying to talk in particular about how gender equality is also sort of elemental to the dynamics of productivity growth. And it's not just about equal access, but it's about how production evolves. So a most immediate example I can think of is the very popularity or success of export-led industrialization itself, and in its early stages, right, drawing primarily from female labor force, partly because it's a new labor force, right, in many countries that has not been as involved in market production, but it's also a particularly low-wage labor force, and one that's employers think is easier to control, and for many other reasons, particularly appropriate to export-led labor-intensive types of production. So that economic model itself, that model for industrialization itself, right, is partly structured on gender, prevailing gender relations. So that's an example of cause as well as consequence. The role of the state, central. I mean, I was thinking, you know, through writing the whole paper and thinking about the challenges, I was thinking in terms of industrial policy, right? And policymakers interested in speeding up industrialization and sort of the way markets are structured right now in terms of the global economy and competitive forces and technological change. It's not going to sort of get you where you want to go. So the role of the state is essential, of course. The last question, I think, is a very big, important one about how to move forward practically in terms of financial constraints and public borrowing in the context of the care economy in particular. And right, one thing that's been demonstrated with the COVID crisis is that a care crisis, a health crisis, can cause a macroeconomic crisis, right? And so that is something that I think has been internalized in a way that it has not before COVID. And so in that sense, I think that the foundation or the stage upon which to make these arguments is really right. But in terms of the question about particular examples, that's something that we have to, or the technical argument, move forward on and develop more completely.
Just a question about lesson. I mean, these are not challenges that you articulate that are specific to developing countries, right? These
That's
forms
right.
And I mean, are there lessons from what you've uncovered and learned in this study that apply to your country, for example?
Yes.
You know, the United States.
Yes.
I mean, what is it that you can take from that that is relevant to the wide agenda issue across the development spectrum?
Well, I think that, you know, in the United States, for instance, the point that I just made about how COVID revealed, right, the essential nature of care work is something that was also revealed in the United States and was responded to over the course of the pandemic in terms of fiscal spending, right, and grants that everyone got, which was based on the number of children that you had. But we are also facing political constraints in terms of advancing, you know, Biden's big Build Back Better bill, which has been put on the back burner. So there was this, I think, an intellectual opportunity in terms of how economists thought about the care economy, but it's been politically constrained in the United States from advancing further, I think. But the fight is still going on.
With the industrial policy coming back into that discussion as well.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, we've run out of time, so obviously these are not debates that are going to end here, needless to say. but let me thank everyone in the room and online for participating. I think the study is now, is it available on the UNCTAD website? So for those people that do want to take a more in-depth look at Elissa's paper, it is available on the UNCTAD website. So Elissa, thank you for coming. Thanks everybody for attending, and we look forward to continuing the conversation in other fora. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.